So I'll be making a teapot here, and a teapot is a little more advanced, just in the simple fact that it's components. There's multiple components. There's the body, a lid seat, which is not an added component. I'll throw that in the first piece. But a handle that goes over the top or the back or wherever you want it, and then a spout. So it's thrown in at least 3 parts. So we'll start with the body. This is precisely 3 pounds of clay. Okay, just as usual, center, as with anything. Okay. Open. I do like to leave a little bit deeper foot on my teapot, so I leave about 3/4 of an inch, maybe a 1/2 inch. I think 1/2 inch is more of a more accurate portrayal. So about that much right there. So about a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to open, as usual, the inside. Well, got a little wild there. But open the inside as wide as I want the base of my teapot, or as wide as I want the foot. So on the inside it'll be about this wide, and then my foot will be about the same width on the outside once I flip this over and trim it. Okay, compensating for that little movement there, the wild movement. So I'm just compressing the bottom and getting it nice and flat. Okay, and then a little swirl for aesthetics. So now, because I did throw that a little bit off, I'm going to recenter. Compensation for that little willy-nilly moment there. And I'm going to pull as usual. Okay, and I'm using my little crab claw. I'm using my middle finger or ring finger and thumb, and then also my pointer finger and this sponge here. Compress my lip on the way up. The lip is really important in a teapot. You want to make sure it's not too thin, because we're going to make a little lip seat later on. Clean off my hands. So another straight pull. Not doing any shaping yet. I'm just going straight up. And again, this is 3 pounds of clay. This is like a small to medium teapot, I guess. Serving for probably about 2 or 3 people. I think it's about 1 pound per person. So again, I'm leaving that lip fairly thick. I'm going to thin it out in just a minute. But I want to make sure I've pulled as much as I'd like. So I think I've pulled as much, but I want to make sure my walls are nice and even. Put a little bit more of that clay down here, push that in there. Yeah, they're pretty even. Yeah, I like that. Feels good all the way up. Now I am going to thin the lip, so I'm just going to continue from here and just squeezing. Let me get below that line. Okay, I'm still got about 1/4 of an inch thickness for the lip. I'm going to get some of the water out of the inside. The sponge I'm throwing with is not very absorbent, so not a whole lot of water in there. So now I'm ready to shape. So I want to make sure I don't have too much slip on my hands on the inside. So I'm gonna bring this out almost like I'm making a bowl, and then about halfway up, I'm just gonna kind of continue going. It's not really even a pull, I may even stop, but I just want to belly this out a little bit. So I'm gonna belly this out. So the outside hand really isn't doing anything other than like extra support, I guess, and a little bit of cleaning up of throwing lines. So right here I'm going back in, and I'll stop right there at the lip. Okay, so that lip's a little bit off. I could trim it off. I'm not gonna bother with it because I do like the thickness. I'm gonna compress. And so now I'm going to use a rib, so just a metal rib. You can use a rubber rib, like a little rubber one. The blue rubber ones work just as well, but the metal one's fine for this. I don't really want to shave any clay off, so I'm going to turn my tool. I like to use my right hand personally because I can tilt it this way and I feel a little bit more coordinated with it, but it really doesn't matter as long as you turn the tool. So if I use my left hand, I'm going to turn the tool the way the wheel's spinning. And I'm really going to use most of this rounded side here. I did get a little bit of clay there. And I'm just making a little bulb, making it nice and round on the inside. Almost like rounding the bottom of a bowl, but you're doing it to the whole thing, not just the little concave in the bottom down here, like on the inside of a bowl. Okay. So I like that shape. I'm just going to kind of clean it up. So I've got a little bulge right here. I'll just take my smooth rib. And this will also make me a little lip seat. So that little sharp edge there, I'll just press up against there. And right here I can see the clay's not making contact against my rib, so I'm going to push out from the inside. Make sure it's nice and round. Okay, get rid of those little throwing lines. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the outside here real quick. But then I'm going to immediately move to that lip seat after I'm done trimming. So if you can, if it doesn't go out too far, you can trim normally. Or as usual. Like so. If it sticks out pretty far and the shape you choose, you can go as tall as you'd like. You can go straight up and domed in. You can go out even more bulbous than this. But if you are going more bulbous, sometimes it's hard to get the modeling tool down underneath it. So sometimes you just use the popsicle stick side down below, trim some of that off, make it nice and clean. And that little excess down here will be trimmed off once I flip this over. So now for the lip seat, this little bead of clay that I have left over. You can decide what type of lid you want to use on a teapot, whether it's recessed or it's going to sit in top. That's probably my least favorite for a teapot, but that's just my personal opinion. I'm sure you can make it work, make it fabulous. But I like either an inset lid, because it sits inside. Say this was completely domed over to a small hole. It sits inside, and when you pour from the teapot, it doesn't allow the lid to move anywhere. Recessed lid is notorious for falling out. This one I'm going to do, because I think it's the most sort of, I hate to say ordinary, that sounds derogatory, but the most commonly seen teapot is a dome lid. But also I want to show the component that would keep a dome lid in. A inset lid is a little self-explanatory. So I'm going to push this in just a little bit. Okay, compress that. Now I'm going to hold with one hand or the other, it really doesn't matter, but I'm going to hold with my left hand here to support that wall. And I'm going to push my finger against this bead of clay. So you won't necessarily see where it's happening with my hands, but you'll see it as it comes around, it'll start to shape. Okay. Then this is sticking out a little too far. Finish that lip seat first. Okay, so I'm going to push that lip in from here quite a bit. Okay. And I'm going to lift the lid seat. Now that I pushed that in, I'm going to lift it back up. And I don't want these edges, this one's not sharp at all, but if you can see on the other side, that one's slightly sharp. And I don't want it to be too sharp because then it's more likely to chip. So I'm going to round it off just slightly with my sponge. Okay, so when I throw the next component, which will be the lid is going to be thrown as a small bowl upside down. Later I'll flip it over, trim it, and it should fit right in my measurements here. And I can really accentuate this line if I want to. Right now it's pretty dull. But if I want to make it a little bit sharper, I can come down, I'm going to come down right here and make it. So after I make that line, I want to kind of round this out again. And then I'll soften that up with a sponge. Okay. Double check everything before I take it off the wheel. Okay, pretty satisfied with that body. So this is the body of the teapot. So tomorrow, after this dries a bit, I'll take this off, cut it off as usual, and I'll flip it over, trim it as usual. And again, you want that lip seat in there, but you don't want this part to be too sharp. If it's too thin, you flip it over to trim it tomorrow, it'll chip and you gotta make a whole new body, which would also entail making a new lid most likely, and also a new spout. So the next component, after making the body, will be the lid. So before I even start making the lid, I'm gonna use my lid master. I'm going to measure inside here, all the way to the edge, right across the middle. So I know that my lid needs to be that wide. So I'll take this off and I'll set it aside. I always double check that because I don't want to have to make another lid working afterwards. Afterward, the piece is dried is difficult. So now for the lid, I don't need that much clay. I have about a half a pound. Okay, half a pound of clay. I have the hardest time centering small amounts of clay. I think larger pieces are easier just because my hands are so big. Okay, so first press is down. Coning up. Coning down. And a clicking sound. Oops, almost lost her. The clicking sound is this bat does not fit very well. I'm going to get it to stick on there soon enough. Okay, this little piece is a tiny bit dry, so I'm adding some water to it. Not the reason I slipped off, but I really want to make sure this is centered. Because it needs to be symmetric like the other one. So now I'm going to open it as usual. Okay. The bottom of this, I'm not putting a foot on it. I'm just going to end up trimming it round. So I don't need quite as much clay on the bottom. So I'll stop, measure. It's a little less than 1/4 inch, but that's plenty for me to trim off. So I do want to make sure that's nice and level all the way across now, so I'm coming out. And I'm going to open almost as far as I need for the whole lid. So it looks like it's about 4 inches maybe. Compress again. This will be fairly important to compress. Not only do I want it flat, not flat, but I'll do a spiral, but I want it clean, and I need this to be pretty reliable. If I end up with a crack in my lid, then that's one component I'd have to throw over again, and hopefully I took measurements and wrote them down. So with the lid master, I would have to measure with the ruler what my teapot was when it was wet. Okay. So we are a little bigger than I need, so I need to go in a little bit. So I'm going to go back, push that back in, and I'm going to recenter that. And again, I'm compressing. Just because I noticed a little bit of sloppiness in there. Okay. Now we're inside by a bit, so now I'm going to pull it up, and then I'm going to slant my walls out just slightly to fit exactly, or as precisely as humanly possible. Push that clay in there, get a decent wall. I don't want this to be too tall, because then it looks funny, and it's just wasted space inside the teapot anyway. So now I'm going to round that inside. Oops, I'm on a roll here. I'm not going to edit any of these errors out, like some of the cooking shows I like to watch. It's best if you see the natural process. Just like when my clay was coming off the wheel there. So I'm going to round the inside just like a bowl, a regular cereal bowl. And I'm pretty sure this is too narrow, but we're going to see, and then I'll bring the walls out accordingly. Yeah, so this one's touching on this side, or like really close. So I got about 1/4 inch to come out. Check again. So getting a little closer, I'm going to bring it out with the lid master in hand. Okay. Now I can feel it grinding on one side. Now I'm going to double check my shape on the inside. Basically my finger will make sure that bottom part is nice and rounded. My finger will keep the wall where it is. And then my spiral. Okay, double check before I shut off the wheel. So really close. It's like right in there. If it was any closer, it'd be hitting the lid master. There I go, making a change. Now I have to double check again. So really close, probably 1/16 of an inch gap in there, maybe a little less. That little spiral I made, I don't like it that sharp, so I just dull that slightly. And I want to keep that lip fairly rounded. I can trim it a little thinner if I need to. So again, tomorrow, I'll cut this off, flip it over, I'll trim it round. Okay, I'm not going to trim a foot or flat. You can do a lot of different things aesthetically, like little tiered layers if you leave a little bit more of a bottom. This one's pretty thin on the bottom. So that is the lid. So again, it'll be trimmed round and it will sit in the teapot. So the last component is the spout. So the spout, there's a million and one ways to do this. I've seen it done with slabs, coils. This one is going to be thrown. Clean off my hands. Just a little bit. This is another 1/2 pound, another small clay ball here. Let's see if I can get this one to stay on the wheel. Okay, and a lot of my students like to stop here just because it's fairly well centered, but really got to go up and down with it a few times. Not necessarily cone way up and cone down aggressively, but just back and forth. Just kind of distributes the various moisture levels, like this was left out a little bit opened. So I felt when I first set it on the wheel, the outside was a little bit dry. And now that I've played with it a little bit and coned up and coned down, I've heard people call it wheel wedging. As far as like the particles of clay and things like that, I think the clay out of the bag is usually pretty good. As far as wedging is concerned, if I'm reclaiming clay, that's a different story. All right, one more time. Okay, so the spout is a tiny bit different in the fact that we don't just open to a certain extent, we open all the way down. Because this will be a tubular form. Tubular. I'm going to go straight down, all the way in. Okay, and it's really dry, so I'm going to add, now that I'm all the way down, it helps me a little bit with control. As far as going down there dry, and I can also see where I'm going. Okay. So right here, I'll clean it up a little bit so you can see, all the way to the back. Okay. All the way to the bat. Now I'm going to recenter again. So now I'm going to throw upwards. The bottom down here, I don't want to get it too thin because I don't want to make it weak, but I do throw it kind of naturally just as I normally would. But this does get cut off later, so I'm not too terribly worried about it. You'll see in the assembly video, once I assemble the piece or the teapot. So here, compressing real quick before I go up. Just kind of feeling between all 3 fingers here, or 4. Making sure it's nice and centered or re-centered before I go up. So now I'm ready for my pull. I do want to pull this kind of inward like a volcano. Okay, this opening would be ridiculous. It's far too open. Later on you have some discretion on what you want as far as being the artist and the user of the teapot, unless you're going to sell it or give it away. So down here, still pretty thick. Pulling that up. Okay, getting a little thin down there. So now I'm just going to double check, make sure my walls are fairly even, make sure I pulled everything from the bottom. This spot's a little thin, but I'll straighten that out as well as I go up. Okay. Now I'm not going to have too much more time to reach inside because I am going to close this in. So I'm going to get some of that water out. Otherwise that water will erode through eventually, especially if I leave it in a locker for a day or two. Okay. I do want to leave a little bit of a belly down here. I see that it's a little off, but I'm going to trim this. Plus I trim it a little bit more even after I get it off of the wheel. I kind of cut it at a slant. So I've got a little belly down here. I like that. But I'm going to start going in right here. So I'm going to use at least 3 points of pressure, collaring. 1, 2, and 3. Might even throw an extra thumb in there for good measure. That thin spot again, it's no biggie. Yeah, as I'm, especially with drier hands, as I'm collaring, it's creating a lot of friction and tension on that little thin spot. Alright, so at this point I am going to trim that because it's getting to be a nuisance. Okay. So again, this time I'm going to pull from down here because when you collar it tends to thicken the clay. So I'm going to pull and thin that out a little bit. So this is probably the last time I'll be able to get inside. So that little thin spot, I'm just going to make sure that everything is squared away. So right here I'm starting to pull between the 2 fingers. This time I'm going to cut a little bit more off just because I don't need that much height. Okay. So again, right here I'm going to pull, but I'm going to go in. Now I know that my finger can no longer go inside of my teapot. So what if I needed to? What if I need to pull up a little bit more clay? Or like in this case, I've got a little slip on the inside there. I could use any number of things, but I like to use the back of my needle tool. But I could even throw this. So this could be my finger, and I could throw against the needle tool. So this spout obviously went in too much, but I'm going to bring that back out. And as usual, too sharp for me to, one, for glaze to adhere to, and two, it's going to make a sharp edge, which is always more prone to chipping. So this is where I fine tune my spout, especially now that I have it on a wheel where it's spinning. Later, I'm going to be flexing and bending this thing in every which way I want to adhere it to my pot and also for form and function. So right now I'm just cleaning the inside with the needle tool, because I can't get in there with my sponge. I could use a paintbrush as well. Sometimes I use a paintbrush, just get a little mildly wet. Okay, you can also shape these as well if you want to with your smooth rib. This one, I don't really think it's necessary, but you could. Sometimes I'll use the round side to form my spout, open it out a little bit. Sometimes I make little lines like that. Any number of things that you'd like to do decoratively. So once these three components are done, the body, the lid, and the spout obviously need to let them dry a little bit. I usually let the spout dry the least, because the spout I'm not really trimming. What I'll do is I'll take a cutting wire and I'll cut from up here at a slant and I'll cut down, and I don't have any of this bottom component left whatsoever, because this spout, it's not going to shoot straight out of my teapot. So let me bring the teapot body over. I don't want the spout stuck on here, sticking straight out. I'll cut it at a slant so that that spout tilts upward, and I want the spout, the end of the spout, about equal to about here, where I would hold liquid inside. That way, if I tilt it or whatever, it doesn't pour out any liquid from the inside when I don't want it to be, as long as it's somewhat level. So that's the body with the lip seat. The spout I'll stick on tomorrow after this is trimmed, and the lid as well. The lid, the only thing I think I left out was that I didn't trim the bottom here, so I would definitely trim that skirt off with the modeling tool before I let it dry for tomorrow. One, it'll dry faster, and two, it'll give me less to trim. So that is the teapot. Assembly coming next.